Hello and welcome back to the God a Case of Wanderlust podcast. I'm your host Lydia, and if you've made it to part 4 of this series, thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate your willingness to learn how you could be a better traveler, because I really believe that we must use our privileges to learn and expand and improve how we interact with the world. So on the last episode, we talked about cultural appropriation and cultural commodification, which are two very complex terms that I encourage you to listen to the last episode and do your research on before listening to this, because on this episode, we're going to be talking about exoticism, which is the underlying concept behind the two practices that I just mentioned. So let's start off with the definition. Exoticism, the tendency to view others from different cultures as quote-unquote exotic or very different. In reality, this mindset is a form of othering that emphasizes another's differences while ignoring the ways they could be similar. And this is problematic because when we only view others in terms of what makes them unique, special, or different from ourselves, we fail to account for their imperfections, their complexities, and their nuances. At best, it's putting a person or culture on a pedestal. At worst, it's dehumanizing. And there's so many examples of exoticism. I've even experienced exoticism myself as a Chinese American. Because I think especially in the West, we exotify the East in terms of, again, like how different the East is, how different their culture is and the way they behave. And again, it's beautiful to see like what makes places different and to appreciate the diversity in this world. But there's a limit to how much we differentiate ourselves from them. So let's talk about photography. This is a really big way it manifests in the tourism industry or this just the travel world in general, not even just the industry. So we used to take photos to preserve memories, but now in the age of social media, many of us take photos to showcase online. And when we take our private moments public, we take responsibility for how we portray them. When we take photos, we have the ability to humanize or dehumanize our subjects, and to reinforce or challenge stereotypes of a place. So say a tourist goes on a slum tour in Mumbai, India, where slum tours are popular, and I covered slum tours in the previous episode, where the tourists take photos of what they see, then they post them on social media with limited contextual information. Do you see the problem here? So, what does this actually tell others about India? What kind of emotions are evoked when people looking at these photos of the slum tours are saying? So, for those who have never visited India before, which is most of the global population, seeing photos of people living in these impoverished conditions only bolsters the incorrect assumption that all people who live in India are poor, thus evoking sympathy for those living in the pictured conditions. This is not a fair representation, as India is far more than its most impoverished communities, just like any other country, including the United States. Furthermore, is it right to assume that the people living in these economic disadvantaged communities are unhappy, which is what these photos without context may suggest, and thus the sympathy is warranted. So just because we perceive something a certain way based on our experiences, it does not mean it's the accurate reality of those with different experiences. We have to avoid injecting ourselves into another person's experiences based off our own, worldview. Because it's a privilege to tell other people's stories, as we have the power to shape their narratives. Yet we fail to recognize this when we post a photo simply to get likes. And I'm going to go into how we could avoid reducing people or places to mere posts on our feed that maintain them as other, by again accentuating how they're different in reference to what we're familiar with, therefore emphasizing that they're almost like a different species, like we're not one and the same. At the end of the day, humans are more similar to each other than not. And I think in this increasingly polarized world, it's so important to remember like the humanity that like connects us all. And again, I'm not trying to be philosophical here, but like I truly deeply believe that we must view others by, again, acknowledging and appreciating their differences, but not to the extent that it creates a division between us and them, creating two separate categories, because we are part of the same category. We're humans with the same human needs and desires. So we have to make sure that before we take photos of local people, especially if we're posting them, to take photos consensually and in a non-extractive way. So before snapping a photo of a local person, ask them if it's okay with them. You know, they're not animals in a zoo, they're human beings. How would you like it if tourist was visiting your local community and taking pictures of you like shopping in the grocery store? Like that would be very invasive. I'm sure most of us wouldn't like that. So before mindlessly taking shots of a scene, consider your intent and if it's appropriate to do so. And before you post about your travels, ask yourself if you're doing justice to the destination by portraying it as fully and respectfully and honestly as you can. One way to do this is by adding context to every photo and a caption in which you can choose to write about, for example, the story behind the photo, what was happening before, during, and or after this moment. Describe the setting's significance. Why here? What's around the area? Is there anything important to mention about this destination? And how does this photo reflect or challenge parts of the culture of a destination? What can you share about this history of the culture that people should be aware of? And who is benefiting from this post? If it's you, it's okay as long as you ensure it's not at the expense of the place or its people. So really questioning your intent behind posting whatever you're posting. Now, I told you in a previous episode, we're going to be talking about the word authenticity. Every traveler wants to know, is what I'm seeing and experiencing authentic? Now, this is, again, tricky. We're getting into the technicalities of language because, like it or not, language profoundly shapes how we perceive things, and it does matter. It does matter what words we use. And authentic is tricky because it's often the only word sometimes that comes to mind when describing if something it fits the representation of what we have in our minds. You know, that's the usual context of the word authentic, but it's problematic in several ways because it's multi-layered and it's unhelpfully vague in its lack of an agreed upon definition because everyone has a different perception of what is authentic, and that is the problem. Who exactly has the authority to decide whether something is authentic or not? Let's go back to the Balinese kikak dance that tourists pay to watch. Tourist interest in seeing a performance stems from a desire to see an authentic, quote-unquote, part of traditional Balinese culture. But as mentioned, this dance is often edited for tourist convenience and is therefore not how the dance has been performed historically. Yet, if the tourist dance performance is held in the site of its creation and performed by the descendants of the people who created it, is it authentic? Everyone has a different answer. A traveler from the United States who knows little about Balinese culture may think it's the most authentic cultural experience ever, while someone in the Balinese community may strongly disagree. But imagine now if the American traveler writes an article about her authentic cultural trip to Indonesia for her hundreds of readers. Do you see the problem? The point is we can't trust the authentic label, as too often authenticity judges have no real insight or experience of the culture they're evaluating. Because these critics, however, come from a group of higher or greater influence and power, their opinion, based off assumption, is valued more than that of a person from that culture. Therefore, disempowering and taking away that culture's autonomy and power and asserting their own story. So if you feel tempted to use the word authentic in your description, consider what exactly you mean by the word. Do you mean non-touristy, original, organic, like what you experienced in X country? Let's try harder to be more specific. Don't pretend to be an expert on a culture you're not a part of, because that is thinking like a colonist, my friend. Let's not let them sure we're not speaking on another culture's behalf. So that wraps up today's episode, and the next episode is our final segment of the series for now. I say for now because, again, this is a topic that I could talk about forever because there's so much nuance and layers to it. But the last episode will be the last part of the series, and I'll see you there. Thank you so much for listening.